Choices always were a problem for you. Orion, be my stars tonight. Fields grow anew with the spring of life. In this sheath of truth will I wrap myself tight. The landscape, it goes for miles. The myths of old, they breathe in me life. Strength comes to those who attest their might. Purity is a blinding light so bright, guiding us to the highest of heights. Running with the wolves and chasing the sun. Sometimes the moments can catch you undone. I see the great spirit in the birds that fly, in the whistle, the call and the cry. In the whistle, the call and the cry. Cold wind, lift me on your wings, fully satisfied in what our mother brings. My thirst is quenched by all the songs you sing, heaping tables fit for kings. Running with the wolves and chasing the sun. Sometimes the moments can catch you undone. I see the great spirit in the birds that fly, in the whistle, the call and the cry.
Okay, we can move forward and examine card number 6, the Lover. As usual, we have a opening quote, this time from James Whisker. Very important quote, and we'll be coming back to it as we proceed. Man, he says, has a pre-existing function of the soul that corresponds to Meister Eckhart's spark of the soul. It was with God, but God sent it into the world to aid him in his struggle with evil. After death, that is, after it has conjoined with others and with God in doing battle with evil, it returns to a contemplation of the Godhead. While here and present, man must sort the iniquity from his soul. This is his individual task. Only if he succeeds can his soul become worthy of God. The soul cannot fly back to the Godhead unless it has purged the darkness from itself. Now, when we looked at the previous 5 cards in the series of the Major Arcana, we realized as we go that those are really archetypes. And so this card actually represents the first stereotype. An actual human as human, corporeal, subject to time and space, the individual. And he embodies or encapsulates what came before. And this is sort of signified by his crossed arms. He's the quartered one, the crucified one, if you will. Because there's really no difference between those images of a man posed like this, or a man on a cross posed with outstretched arms. But when it comes to archetypes, when it comes to the difference between archetypes and stereotypes, we need to know that there is a fundamental difference. And in his book, Civilization in Transition, Carl Jung helps us get to grips with this difference. He says, the archetypes are, as it were, the hidden foundations of the conscious mind. They are inherited with the brain structure. Indeed, they are its psychic aspect. They are then essentially the chthonic portion of the psyche. That portion through which the psyche is attached to nature. So these archetypes are the foundations. Chthonic is an important word that means roots. And previously, in our last program, we even asked whether we know how the pillars of consciousness get established, how they get laid. And maybe we can penetrate into their mystery, and maybe we can't. Are we unable to know about those deep, dark realms? Or is there some sort of consciousness, something we can do to get to grips with what they are? So as we said, the lover, he may embody these archetypes, man may embody these archetypes, but is he really able to get beyond his conscious mind and penetrate into the mystery of what they are? Like any root, like anything that has roots or foundations, it can be beneath the soil, out of conscious cognition and vision. But one thing that Jung also always tried to emphasize is that those roots are not static. The archetypes themselves change, just as conscious mind does, right? Just as reason does. We're constantly changing as we experience things. But those deep, dark roots are also changing. It's like there's a relationship, a dance that goes on between the two. And then the conscious experiences that change the archetypes then respond, it's like call and response, and they change the complexion of the conscious mind. So there's an incredible interactivity there. But in the quote from Jung, we saw that the archetypes aid and abet our connection with nature. So there's really nature as well. This thing is a tripart, interlocking system. And so the archetypes in some way perhaps help us get to know about nature, nature's ways. But we see also that this figure has a coat of many colors. And on one level, that can symbolize just the simple variegation of existence, the multifariousness of being. One man is really many men. One life contains many lives. And again, those many colors symbolize what needs to be brought together and harmonized. Man is a variegated palette, but he has to bring together all of the different shades and colors. It's quite similar, in fact, this figure, to the famous jester of normal playing cards, who again is a quartered one, a kind of a harlequin character with a robe of many colors. Now, in Hermetic language, this figure is what is known as the anthropos, also Adam Kadmon, simply the original man. And again, he contains everything that exists. The cosmos is contained within him. Nothing is without. He contains it all. But that man, that lover figure, what does he do about that? If he's aware that he's the embodiment of all that is, what's he going to do about it? That choice to do something about it or not to do something about it, isn't that going to affect the rest of the world, the rest of history, the rest of human existence? Because that man is going to decide, as we said in previous programs, to remain either a hedonic person, narcissistic, banal, going along with the flow, or he'll move to a hylic, phosphoric level of existence. It's almost like Neo in the movie The Matrix. We're dealing with that kind of choice. And the choice is going to affect not only the chooser, but everyone he comes into contact with. In the Hermetic tradition, this anthropos, this Adam Kadmon, is simply the repository of the light and the energy that creates all. And therefore he's like all of us. We are all embodiments of that universal order and the light that creates all. We'll have more to say on that concept as we proceed. But let's look at the number. Number 6. The first 5 cards then could represent the 5 senses, perhaps. We noticed that the symbol of the pentagram cropped up previously as being important. So number 6 represents the synthesis then of what came before, the synthesis of the 5. And that is obviously consciousness or the mind, and perhaps even the physical body. After all, there are 6 apertures in the head, 2 ears, 2 eyes, the nose and the mouth. That's 6. So in a way it establishes the human being, or the summit of creation. And of course the number 6 is related to the cube. A strange object, you can only see 3 sides of a cube at a time, no matter how you turn it. 3 sides are visible, 3 sides invisible to us. If you unpack a cube, it makes a perfect Latin cross. 4 in the vertical and 3 in the horizontal. And the cube, also seen from a geometrical point of view, marks out a hexagram. It's a 6-pointed star. The famous hexagram is also can be seen when you look at a 3-dimensional cube and you make it 2-dimensional. And that's a very ancient Aryan symbol, symbolizing biunity, the coming together of opposites, but where those opposites merge together. So maybe they're no longer opposites. There's a third level that gets created out of the 2 coming together, the 2 triangles coming together. And we'll speak of the concept of biunity and how important that is as we go. But when it comes to cubes, we often see the pharaoh sitting enthroned upon a cube. And we'll see the significance of that when we deal with the Kabbalistic meaning of this card. And on the throne, you often see the pharaoh making the crossed arms, or something that is very close to that. Again, similar to Christ being on the Latin cross. So whether it's a cube and a being sitting on it with his arms crossed, or an open cube, a cross, a Latin cross with a man on it with outstretched arms, there's something happening there. Now, on an exoteric level, people look at that image of the crucifixion all day long and never, conceive of anything like that. But on an esoteric level, there's a lot being told to us there. Even the fact that in many depictions of the crucifixions, there's 3 crosses, and 3 4s is 12, and so on. And that's a famous zodiological number. But we also have the number 6 cropping up in the very early books of the Old Testament. God creates the universe, no less, in 6 days. We take it for granted that our week is 7 days, but how did that even come to be? Why that number and not some other? Now if we turn to the imagery, you'll notice right away that I'm not using the card image from the Thoth or the Rider-Waite. This is a little bit different. That's because that as far as the tarot studies go, of whatever age and from whatever tradition, there is really no more misunderstood card than number 6. And this is because of its name, the Lovers, and often the imagery that exoteric researchers attribute it to romantic love and to unification. But this, again, as I say, is unfortunate, as is the name of the card, actually, when we really come down to it, because it's not a card of marriage as we would understand it. In fact, I even think that this is depicting any kind of wedding, as you see on the Rider-Waite, on the Thoth deck, as you see that image. To think that this could possibly represent a physical wedding, or even a mystical chemical wedding, is quite naive, because it's just simply too early on in the major arcana. If you consider the major arcana the journey or path of the Fool, then something so mystical, is a little early, one would think. And simply when you do your homework and look at all of the different correspondences, you find out that this is not a card that symbolizes love, biunity, or conjunction. In fact, it represents separation, division, and schism. And in fact, in common readings and common divination, for divination purposes, a better name for this card would actually be disharmony. Esoterically, you might want to call it awakening, in the sense of a spiritual conception, especially when we look at the lover in the French rendering. Something is awakening in the sense of a spiritual more than a physical conception. And we'll see why this is again as we proceed. But the card represents the alchemical stage known as separatio. And if we look at the Rider-Waite, you'll actually see that the card here, the angel in it, this important being in the center of the card, is making a gesture of separation, not of bonding. Right? That's a symbol of division, actually. And once we realize that this is a card that represents scission or bifurcation, the fall, fracture of consciousness, the interplay of opposites, we'll be on the right track to unpacking its meanings. As I said, in divination, it signifies dilemmas, contradictions, choices, and doubts. And perhaps seeking advice. It's an advice card. Seeking advice from wiser people, more experienced people. And the reverse then might represent that we are failing to take that advice, which often happens. Clients often have been given advice before from certain people, and they're loath to take it for some reason. They're loath to accept that people are more experienced and may know what to advise. But again, that all depends on the spread that you're doing and the nature of the client's question. The interpretations of these cards, both in an upright and a reverse position, are laid out in my book, The Path of the Fool, which you can refer to for those divination meanings.
Now with all this going on, this is going to be worse than ever.
It don't have to be.
No, sure it does.
Why? You got a lot going on, kid.
Oh, what, my last name? That's the reason I got a decent job. That's the reason why people deal with me in the first place. Now I start to get a little ahead. I start to get a little something for myself, and this happens. Now I'm asking you as a favor not to go through with this, okay? This is only gonna end up bad for you, and it's gonna end up bad for me.
You think I'm hurting you?
Yeah, in a way you are.
It's the last thing I ever wanted to do.
I know that's not what you want to do, but that's just the way that it is. Don't you care what people think? Doesn't it bother you that people are making you out to be a joke and that I'm gonna be included in that? Do you think that's right? Do you?
You ain't gonna believe this. But you used to fit right here. I'd hold you up and say to your mother, this kid's gonna be the best kid in the world. This kid's gonna be somebody better than anybody ever knew. And you grew up good and wonderful. It was great just watching you. Every day was like a privilege. Then the time come for you to be your own man and take on the world, and you did. But somewhere along the line, you changed. You stopped being you. You let people stick a finger in your face and tell you you're no good. And when things got hard, you started looking for something to blame, like a big shadow. Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. Now, if you know what you're worth, now go out and get what you're worth. But you gotta be willing to take the hits and not pointing fingers saying you ain't where you wanna be because of him or her or anybody. Cowards do that, and that ain't you. You're better than that. I'm always gonna love you no matter what. No matter what happens. You're my son, you're my blood. You're the best thing in my life. But until you start believing in yourself, you ain't gonna have a life.
So as I said, this Oswald Wirth deck image, I think, is more appropriate on an esoteric level, and certainly will favor it in this program, although we will analyze the other more familiar decks, the Rider-Waite and the Thoth. But notice in the Oswald Wirth that the figure, the young man, stands at the peak of a pyramid. And this clearly denotes him as the Sun King or Solar Child. He's Ra in one mode, which is the sun. And, of course, the famous crossed arms, is usually a symbol of death. But we understand that the Egyptians were mystical people, and the death could also not just represent the death that we are familiar with, but it can also represent incarnation, actually. It's not just internment in the tomb and then moving on to the other world. It can also represent the fall of spirit into matter. But as a matter of fact, there is a god, a very important god in the Amonist or Theban pantheon, called Khonsu. He was actually the son of Amun-Ra, which means a manifestation of Ra. And Mut, the goddess Mut, I believe. And Mackenzie, in his book Egyptian Myth and Legend, tells us about Khonsu. He says that Khonsu was depicted as a handsome youth, and he symbolized in the Theban group of gods certain specialized influences of the moon. He was a love god, the Egyptian Cupid. He was also an explorer, because the root of his name, Kens, signifies to travel or to traverse. And he was also the messenger and hunter of the gods. So at least that helps us understand some of the imagery in Oswald Worth deck, this bow and this arrow motif. This is an image of Khonsu, and those who think that the card shows Cupid were right, but behind Cupid, this ludicrous Grecian Roman model image is a much more ancient deity, the son of Amun-Ra, the traveler. But he's associated with the moon as well, which is kind of interesting. You'll see that might be a little contradictory until we understand how symbols, there's a merging together of lots of different symbols. There's a lot of play with these various deities and symbols, especially in the Egyptian context, of how they all come together synergetically. But of course, this makes him also very close to Hermes, the traveler. Makes him close to Hermes and Mercury. They were travelers. The ability to traverse heaven and hell, Olympus and Hades. And in images of Khonsu, we see that he has the crescent horns, but also the crescent of the moon, whereas other gods have the crescent of the moon and then the sun, like Ra would have, for instance, or even Horus. But in this instance, the crescent and the disk, or lunar. Does that mean that Khonsu is really reflecting light from somewhere else? He's not quite a solar god, but he's maybe an agent of a hidden light, or he represents a reflection of light that's actually emanating from somewhere or someone else. And his title was Greatest God of the Great Gods. So the Amonists thought very highly of him. He was also described as a great serpent, a great primordial serpent that gives birth to the universe, gives birth to what was known as the mundane egg. And in that instance, he's very much like a demiurgic character. Demiurg, a very important word. We have links below for those not familiar with that. A Rex Mundi, a lord of the world, an artifex, a creator of the world. But of course, Mackenzie is pointing out that Khonsu is also a god of love. We see bows and arrows, and that indicates what? That indicates the hunt, or even battle or war. And yet Khonsu is considered, like Cupid, the god of love. That's an interesting synergy again. We would think of that as contradictory, you see. And now the two women that are shown in the card, we've met them before. Right? In previous programs we met the Reti, the sisters of two lands. Again, those beings indicating the unification of not two lands, but two realities. Higher and lower, if you will. More appropriately, inner and outer, or other apparent dualisms. And that's interesting too, because in the Gnostic canon, in the Hermetic canon, the goddess Sophia, which is wisdom, is actually described often as being a duad, being a syzygy. We're often not aware of that. A lot of people aren't. That the goddess Sophia is actually often described as a higher and lower manifestation of that goddess, or two goddesses, a hidden and a visible one. Very similar to what we have in Egypt with Isis and Nephthys, but again, we know that Christianity and even other traditions borrowed liberally from the Egyptians, so in one way it's not a surprise. But these are the archetypal women, and the stereotypical one, or mortal one, immortal and mortal, heavenly and worldly. They're even known as the left Sophia and the right Sophia. So look how this Oswald Worth deck image of the lover, look how appropriate that is. And of course this is the Alpha and Omega. And for those who are not aware of the Gnostic Sophia, she is the goddess of wisdom. That's what the word actually means. If you take off the S, you just get Ophia, which is a word meaning serpent. This is why the concept of Eve and various other goddesses and the serpent are so closely entwined. Well, here it is even in the name. But she's the wisdom bringer, a personification of the process of intellectual awakening that can free a trapped soul, you see, from this cage of matter that the Gnostics believe that we're in. We looked at that earlier as well. Right? That this is the cage, the creation is the cage, a very central concept in Gnosticism and some other supposedly mystical traditions. And it's also, concept is a little bit echoed, the concept of these dual aspects of a single feminine principle, let's say, is also backed up in certain Kabbalistic traditions, because there's actually two manifestations of everything, two sources of all manifestation, I should say, and they are described as the Ein and the Ein Sof. You see, Hebrew words Ein and Ein Sof. There's actually a third one too, the Ein Sof Or, meaning the light that emanates. But the Ein is often, in fact even in Hebrew the word connotes eye. So the Ein and the Ein Sof, right? The Ein is an eye that can open and close, giving forth a light. So the opening and the closing of this great eye is the Ein and the Ein Sof, let's say. And then the light, there's a light upon when the eye opens, a light of creativity and manifestation appears. But as I say, the whole process in Kabbalah is these two realms. But the interesting thing is that in the ancient symbolism, the single eye is actually a feminine symbol. And this is again something that's not widely known. It's associated with the goddess, not a god. And even that famous Eye of Horus that you see, the famous Eye of Horus in Egyptian mythology, is actually known as Udjath, and that's a goddess's name, an ancient early serpent goddess, you see. So eyes and the female goddess are connected. In fact, just of interest is this self-portrait by the mystic Hermetic painter Nicolas Poussin, neoclassical artist. In his self-portrait, he was an initiate, you see. He was a member of the underground stream that we've spoken of before, one of these Masonic types. In his own self-portrait, you'll see behind his head, I think it's on the left of the canvas, the symbol of an unknown goddess. But if you actually hone in on that goddess, actually scroll in and examine the headdress of that goddess, you'll see that she's bearing a single eye. And these guys, they knows what they knows. And we better start knowing what they know. But when it comes to duplex deities, feminine deities, we have the Ark of the Covenant bears two female angels on either side of the Ark, right? We have Venus, we've spoken of before, as the Venus of the morning star and the evening star, two phases of that. In many paintings, especially of Venus, you'll see her holding a mirror and with a reflection. You know, what's that all about? Venus is reflected because there's two of them. In the Old Testament, we've got two women, Eve and Lilith, right? Picked up later on with Demeter and Persephone, goddess of the hidden and the underworld, and a goddess of light and manifestation. We have Hecate, a duad or even a triple goddess, but she's certainly a goddess of junctions, the junction or crossroads. She's the goddess of crossroads. We have Martha and Miriam turning up in the Bible. We've got the two Marys, the famous duad of the two Marys at the foot of what? At the foot of the crucifix. And in fact, in various countries, you'll find that statues or images of the Virgin Mary are actually also placed at junctions and crossroads and even roundabouts. In Celtic legend, you've got this romantic concept of the dark and the fair sisters, a recurrent myth through Celtic and pre-Celtic mythology, very important motif. In fact, even in modern day, you got it turns up in all sorts of contexts. One is the Wizard of Oz, where you have the two witches. There's not just one witch, there's two. There's the wicked witch, of course, and then there's this Glenda, the good, who actually appears when? At the beginning and the end. Right? Alpha and Omega. She appears at the beginning and the end of the drama. And even, we said that Khonsu really is what we're dealing with when we're looking at the archer figure above the figure's heads. But, as a matter of fact, that arrow shooting deity is associated with lunar worship and lunar imagery. There's goddesses such as Ngame, Ngame, who are described as an archer, but this time the arrows that they shoot bestow life instead of taking life away. It's sort of the reverse. It animates. So the shooter is actually animating, activating life. Perhaps it's the animation of sexual desire. That's possible. And of course we know that the awakening of sexual desire within a male or a pubescent male has enormous consequences, doesn't it, for womankind. It's not something insignificant. The ancients would have looked at that as being a very important moment, a rite of passage, which it deeply affects the lives of women. But anyway, even in mythology in general, it is not uncommon for the sun, the Horus-like sun, you see, to be an agent for his mother, to be sent on important errands by her, or for him to embody her quest in some way. We see this in the Arthurian legends with Mordred, but it's quite common in other traditions as well. And again, I can't help thinking that that arrow in some way is similar to the Ein Sof Or, the light, that once the eye is open, the light goes forth to create and to emanate. You know, so we can see that that light is the lover. See, the lover is the light. He's in human form, but so is Christ. But that son of the goddess, that sun. And we've also seen that the Kabbalah is often described as a lightning flash. So arrow, lightning flash, emanation of light. And that's what the sun is. He's an embodiment of a kind of spiritual light.
Francisca.
I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Now if we turn to examining the Rider-Waite image, we see that what I've been saying is actually confirmed, because this is indeed separatio. That red mountain separates the figures. It's between them. The gesture of the angel is dividing and separating. It's not about reconciliation. It's more about expulsion. It's the enmity that is put between the man, Adam, and the female Eve by Jehovah, as related to us in the book of Genesis. Why any God would want to do that? Well, that's a separate question, but there you have it. But of course, when we're talking about these male and females, or masculines and feminines, we realize that it's not really an external play, it's an internal one, because these are modes of being, they're modes of character. They're within us. But even at the conception of the fetus, there's this scission of the gametes. There's the splitting of the chromosomes, then the division of hemispheres in the brain. Behind her, we see the ancient symbol of the tree and the serpent, always associated with the goddess, always associated with her. But that serpent and tree is just simply a massive archetypal symbol. I've dealt with it in my Atlantis book, and we'll be revisiting it and looking at it in another way in the Female Illuminati program, because it's so multifaceted as a symbol. But in short, the serpent and the tree and the female are connected because Eve really is the tree. The female is the tree of life. And that's a tree interestingly, that really, although it's mentioned in Genesis, isn't dealt with a lot throughout the Bible. There's only about 2 references in the whole Bible to the tree of life, which makes one think why that would be. But this is Merudanda, the great world tree, or Shushumna in the East. And in these traditions, sometimes there is more than one tree. There's a northern tree, and a southern tree, or a western tree, versus an eastern tree. Classic archetypal symbolism there. Behind the male, we see an interesting tree with 12 flames on it. And the flame is active, so we realize that this does represent the masculine polarity. He's ever moving, ever energized, ever in a state of becoming, ever inquiring into the nature of things, into the nature of woman, and also into the nature of himself. And the fact that there's 12 flames may have some zodiological denotation there, with man being a 12-fold being. We could see that. And perhaps this is the other tree mentioned in Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now that was a kind of an odd translation. That original Hebrew can be translated in other ways. For instance, the tree of everything, just the tree of good and bad, for instance, or good and bad alike. And probably even more specifically, it really represented the discernment to be able to tell between good and evil. Here are 2 realities forever conjoined, bad and good, or evil and good. And we have the human being is in the position always as the discriminator. He has to discern between the two. And this is very key to the understanding of the esoteric meaning of this card. Because to gaze on anything outside of us is ultimately to be using our discernment on some level. Whether it's a human being that comes in front of us, you see, or it's a thing. That's the beginnings of science, but we don't even need to go that far. That's just basic to the human being. We can inquire into the inner nature of things. We can find out what a thing is. And we can even question, like we do in the case of human beings, are they presenting themselves as they really are? All of this kind of thing. But the very fact that we can even inquire into the nature of anything is philosophically the statement that we are transcendent, what's called transcendent. That's a fancy word, but it's not hard to understand. We are the ones who can inquire into our own nature. We're the ones who can inquire into the meaning and the significance and the inner nature of things. Hopefully, we do it in relation to ourselves. But having those capacities also means that we might not use them. That's a choice. This card's all about choices. But we have the choice to not bother inquiring deeply about anything. Now, interestingly, the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, actually prohibits from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and penalizes man for doing so. Now, are we to take that as some sort of prohibition against using discernment? One would hardly think so, but what are we to think? Why would God want to punish man for that? For using his reason, for using his discernment, for trying to comprehend the difference between good and evil. Is there a reason for that? What might happen if man proceeded along those lines to use his reason to tease out? Might that have some consequences for the God of the Bible, the God of religion? And in the process of inquiring into things, isn't that strengthening individualism? Isn't that positing us as an I am creature? Right? Here I am. I may be. One consequence of that discernment is separation from a thing. But in that separation, in that objectivity, I am able to posit my own existence. And tree of good and evil, since those things are deeply linked, you can't really have one without the other. They refer to each other constantly. Then the coming together, man is the embodiment of those things, where those two realities become fused, because we're assuming that these are realities we get to know. They're not just out there. These are things that are pertinent to human consciousness, right? People embody these polarities, so-called polarities. Some men are wise, some are ignorant. Most of us are wise and ignorant. And is there a harmony between these apparent polarities? Well, let's examine the yin-yang symbol, for instance, the black and white. In the black you see the white, in the white you see the black. And then you have this wavy line running between the black and the white. But rather than seeing that as the place of separation, could it not be the place where the two have come to meet? Could that wavy line not represent a locus of unity, where two apparent dichotomies, contradictory forces come together and actually blend and know each other? But then of course we also have the outer ring, the outer circle that encompasses them. That's the symbol of what? That's the symbol of the greater unity, of which the two polarities are but a part or an expression. Wow. So what, from one perspective, probably the wrong perspective, we see the black and the white, the good and the evil, as being antithetical, unrelated. But from the higher perspective, these are two expressions of a single reality. Now we don't see this, of course, anymore, but we've been trained not to see it. The world is in our head, right? Thought. There's nothing in consciousness that isn't found in the world. There's nothing in your consciousness that is not found in the external world. But now that that world in miniature, in compressed form, in a simulacra form, is now found in your head, in consciousness, well, it's come under your control now, and you can choose to change it and reconfigure it. It's not reality anymore, it's mental reality. Oh dear. Because humans go on then to reconfigure that so it no longer agrees with the reality. And it's peppered with all sorts of mysteria. The configuration is not necessarily a very holistic one, is it? But obviously, as one progresses along the mystic path, one realizes that, look, these good and evils are really like black and white squares on a single board. They're like stepping stones to higher realities, right? And you need each step, black, white, black, all the way down. Both are needed. But the thing is, what kind of relationship do we have with these realities? Do we love one and hate the other? Is that what it's all about? Now, in the Rider-Waite deck, we not only see the three figures, but we see this curious fact, and that is that the male figure is gazing at the female figure, who's looking upward to the angelic form. So is this angelic form a manifestation of the higher self of both beings? Or is it the image of God, or what? Is it an angel? But the very fact that he's looking to her makes me think that this is indeed a rendition of Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, the goddess who entered the world in order to lead beings, man, Adam, whatever you want to call it, back to a state of perfection. And so she represents the higher force. She's actually not the higher force because she's looking at the higher force, but she's a conduit for it, to help man anchor himself and orientate. She's a sort of a channel for the wisdom, which helps him orientate himself metaphysically. Gives him some sort of metaphysical comprehension that then places him existentially in the world. And in fact, it's quite interesting. A lot of people debunk mysticism and metaphysics and any kind of abstract speculation, say, of a religious or metaphysical nature. But perhaps we can also ask, isn't it important to have some concept that there's something higher than oneself or higher than what one sees? I'm not advocating it, I'm just asking, can't that be a healthy thing to help us see that we are limitless beings? What happens if we didn't have that? What happens if we just really did operate on the lowest level of five senses without any metaphysical speculations? What kind of people would we be? We have to ask that of the scoffer. And I'm not saying those metaphysical realms are even true or real, but if we didn't cognate that, if we didn't envision something greater than ourselves, what kind of people would we be? Isn't it important for us to know ourselves as limitless and that all possibilities are open to us? Well, you know, the materialist atheist says, no, that's destructive, that's pulling you away from what is. You don't need to contemplate any of that stuff. It's actually doing you damage. But the metaphysician will say, we are infinite. But the question more importantly arises, if we're infinite and there is something vaster, higher, deeper, if there are no limits to our own capacities and what we can do with our inner environment, for instance, then are we acting on this earth in ways that look like it's justifying that knowledge? That's quite deep knowledge, isn't it? That's quite astounding. But are we doing something to justify it? I mean, if all possibilities are open to us, are we actualizing those possibilities? And again, as we said earlier, if you have that, if possibilities are open to us, if there is something greater, we also can choose to not do anything about it and remain on a hedonic level, a decision that is definitely going to change the world in which we live. The female looks upward, yes. She's not looking to the male, she's looking upward to this higher figure, this angelic figure, which means that she is not the higher self herself. The higher self is itself. She's looking to it. And that gaze tells you that she's attuning herself to it, to that higher wisdom, to that higher being. And if she loses that attunement, then the connection breaks for all, including the Adam figure. He's sort of looking to her, he's relying on her, but if her attunement breaks, oh dear, there's something falls apart. So it's an intriguing perspective there. And there are some Gnostic schools, groups, sects, or whatever, that did believe that the female Sophia fell out of attunement with the Godhead and did get lost in the creation in their attempt to liberate man, and that she actually failed in that enterprise. But that's another program, and we can't get into that subject here. But of course, given that this is Eden, this is a Garden of Eden scene, well, then we know that the attunement is lost, was lost, and broken. One can't have ecstasy permanently. Pain was required for man to evolve from a state of innocence in the garden. And it really hardly matters at the end of the day what caused that fall, caused the breach. Was it temptation of a kind, or sexuality, as some have theorized? Is it simple curiosity? Was it disobedience? Again, relatively unimportant. We see that in order to continue to inhabit the Garden of Eden in that innocent, naive state is really to just remain a child in the playground, permanently caged within the pleasure principle. And interestingly, the leader of the Golden Dawn, whose work is behind the creation of the Rider-Waite deck, did call this card the Lovers. We've talked about how problematic that is. It's not particularly a good name, but he named it this way, perhaps to direct our attention to the fact that the love he's talking about here is the force that polarizes, is the force that causes loss of self, as well as the discovery of selfhood. And that reminds me of Mikhail Naimi, his statement, the author. He says, a man made prisoner by the love of a woman and a woman made prisoner by the love of a man are equally unfit for freedom's precious crown. And in the earlier version, the Oswald Worth deck, we found the French rendition, we saw that two women are there. Two women are present. So some think the lover is choosing. He's in an active choice between a rich and a poor lady, between sacred and profane love, between something good and something bad, and which he's choosing because he'll choose whichever one matches his own character, his own nature, isn't he? Some see it as a move from the lover, the older female, the mother, females embody a mother, and females can also be the lover in a man's life. So this is the transition from the mother, state of being with the mother and being in her power, her influence, and then moving out into the more autonomous state, moving towards the lover. But this is important because we know that mothers affect their son's choice of a lover or a wife. Very deeply, deeply so. They affect the nature of a man's relationships. But as we also implied, this imagery of the two females is just simply never to forget that it is very antique. It's a very ancient image that goes back to the time of matriarchies, to very early times when the sexual role of fathers was largely unknown. and therefore symbolically the lover is the father, on a mythical level that is, not physical. Right? He's the mother's lover. He conceives himself. The younger man grows through a woman to conceive a child that grows to be a father and so on. He does not conceive the female. He conceives himself. So, although there's only one figure in the Oswald Worth deck, one lover, one male figure, he embodies all of the males. There's many males there. There's the father, there's the son, there's the warrior, there's the champion, the leader and the king. Two females but one male, because he, the single male figure, actually encapsulates them all. This is the way that the mythic vision saw it. To help us understand this, we read from Alexander Hislop, from his book The Two Babylons. He's speaking of Osiris here. He says that Osiris was represented in Egypt as at once the son and husband of his mother, and actually bore as one of his titles of dignity and honor the name husband of the mother. This still further casts light on the fact, already noticed, that the Indian god Ishvara is represented as a babe at the breast of his own wife, Isi or Parvati. Now this all sounds very crazy, but in later programs like the Female Illuminati, we'll be attempting to unravel tangles like this to find out what's actually going on. Basically, the women here, the two women, represent a chain of women responsible for birthing not one individual but the whole of mankind. The archetypal mother, as we said, and then her reflection, the stereotypical mother. This is the gynocracy that stands distinct from other institutions of the world, representing what might be described as a higher unity, so to speak. And we saw this archetypal mother in previous programs as Ta'urt, the primordial hippo goddess. And that all other forms, all other women are really manifestations and personifications of her. Right? Again, the heavenly and earthly mothers, eternal and all-pervading.
Mother, do you think they'll drop the bomb? Mother, do you think they'll like the song? Mother, do you think they'll try to break my balls? Mother, should I build the wall? Mother, should I run for president? Mother, should I trust the government? Mother, will they put me in the firing line? Mother, am I really dying?
Now the Jungian, Eric Newman, he writes about this birth of the ego represented by the youth. He says, at the stage of the separation of the world parents the germ of ego consciousness finally asserts itself. While yet in the fold of the creation myth, it enters upon the second cycle, namely the hero myth, in which the ego consciousness and the human world become conscious of themselves and of their dignity. And he also writes of the mother-lover relationship. He says, by differentiating himself from the unconscious and reaffirming his masculine otherness, he very nearly becomes the partner of the maternal unconscious. He is her lover as well as her son. We saw that before, that there's a separation by all means, implicit in all of this, but there's also a getting to know a thing on an intimate level. So in one sense, this lover, who is us, who's individual consciousness, in a way is the champion of the feminine power, that is of the unconscious. And that means that the path he's walking, that we're walking, is really her path. It may lead away from her, but it also leads back to her. She is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. She is the maternal wholeness from which he must depart. But now he has a picture of that wholeness. He knows all about it. He doesn't have it anymore, but he's seeking for it. So the whole concept, we just talked about maybe that metaphysical reality, spurious as it is on one level, may be very necessary for us to have. Well, yeah, but because we are seeking for this wholeness in various ways. Not having it, we have then the pangs of alienation, and that's not very pleasant. So we're always seeking for that return of wholeness and completion. Very important to what humans are all about. Other life forms have that only on a much more instinctual and basic level, if at all. But once having this sense of completion, we are forever, the desire, let's say, the desire is always there, present in the human being. It's awakened now. The early state of the awakening to get back to that lost paradisical state, and that of course is indeed represented by the Garden of Eden on one level. So in one sense, this card can represent the beginning of the process of the search for wholeness, the early shaky stages of realizing that we're alienated from a state of wholeness, and now we have to go about regaining that lost state. And that's in itself a tremendously archetypal motif or theme. In fact, Carl Jung himself, the psychologist, in one of his diaries, in one of his autobiographies, actually mentions that he had a very similar experience to what we're talking about, and very much, I think, corresponds to the Oswald Wirth image that we're looking at in this program. He actually said that when he was relatively young, and still in his early stages, dealing with his relationship with Sigmund Freud and their similarities and differences, and he was looking basically for his own path, or whether or not he'd ever have one. He was in a state of turmoil. He didn't really know if he had a destiny with this subject of psychoanalysis. And he was at home and he happened to open a Bible that belonged to his mother. He opened his mother's Bible, bibliomancy, so to speak, just flippantly, just carelessly, and he opened it to get guidance just by opening the Bible at any page. And it turned out that his eyes fell at Isaiah, verse 35, and we can read it. It says, "And a highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools, shall not enter therein." Right? Really interesting there, that a way shall be open for him, and it's a way of holiness. And it's certainly not going to be a way that fools are going to tread for too long. They might try it and then they're out of there. So it's a road of wisdom, isn't it? It's Sophia's way. It's the path of wisdom. Now if we go a bit deeper into the whole question of choices, which is what this card is really about on one level, we find out that really we're not just running around making choices because we've got nothing better to do. The world forces choices upon us. We're compelled to make choices. Reality presses upon us. We're out here in the Mitwelt, in the Umwelt, and entities and beings must be negotiated. And they all do not, as Nietzsche said, conform to our will and what we want. And in fact, even the totality of phenomena threatens to overpower the germ, the ego germ that Newman is talking about. But at the same time, in resisting the force of the world, what are we doing? And when we're set off against the entities and the beings that we're meeting and coming into contact with, this very resistance, we come upon ourselves. We've mentioned this before, but we learn, we have a sense of our identity, our purpose, our power, and even our intentions by this very fact. Now, most people just want to be negotiating the world. Oh, there's a world out there with all its lights, flashing lights and interesting things, I'm only after that. But the strange thing is that simultaneously, you're actually discovering about yourself whether you like it or not. This is almost fundamental. It may not even be a choice that one is interested in self-knowledge, but self-knowledge is going to come with active living and the very, very negotiation of the things of the world. The two go together, they're fused. We learn to exert our will. And many a time we'll realize that we have to decide upon a course of action and a path to tread. In the Rider-Waite we saw that the male stands behind the tree with flames on it. So there's an activity involved in choosing our own course in life. In the Thoth version, which is interesting, you see the presence of a priest. There's that marriage taking place. We said it wasn't the best imagery that could be chosen, but just for the moment, notice the presence of the overarching priest. He may be the Hierophant, let's say from the previous card, if you will. But that again indicates that we're not really choosing according to our own desires. We're choosing what's expected of us. There's the authority figure. So we're sitting there sort of passive. We go by the standards and the commonly established rules and regulations. There's still a higher authority guiding us and telling us what to do and approving of our decisions. This all comes with the territory. And then when you turn to the Oswald Wirth image again, that pose, it's like he's standing there like some sort of shot dummy in that sense. The man who, he's got all this power to choose and power to resist and power to carve his own way, and he stands there not doing it. So he's ready to be dressed like some shot dummy there, posed and dressed as others see fit. True selfhood as yet remote. No differentiation, no individuation as yet. And most men remain in that state eternally. That's the problem. Remaining completely docile. Or the only time they do actually show any action is when they want to upgrade themselves, a couple more stripes, so that they can then mold and dress others. Is this what it's all about? Remaining completely dummy-like and docile? Or the only time you actually show any so-called selfhood is just so you can upgrade yourself so that you can then be, bossing everybody else around? Is that what it's all about?
The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride, and we kill those people. Shut him up. We have a lot invested in this ride. Shut him up. Look at my furrows of worry. Look at my big bank account and my family. This has to be real. It's just a ride. But we always kill those good guys who try and tell us that. You ever notice that? And let the demons run amok? But it doesn't matter because it's just a ride. And we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love. The eyes of fear, once you put bigger locks on your door, buy guns, close yourself off. The eyes of love, instead, see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all that money we spend on weapons and defense each year and instead spend it feeding, clothing, and educating the poor of the world, which it would many times over, not one human being excluded, and we can explore space. together, both inner and outer, forever in peace.
Now we can analyze this card also in relation to time. We come up with some interesting insights. Time is important to this card, particularly the future tense. Because of course this figure in the Oswald Worth deck is like the Fool setting off on a journey. He's about to embark. Very similar to the Fool in that aspect. But the step forward, let's try to grasp this point. To step forward in time implies that you had a past. A place of beginning and a history. Because you're moving from that point forward on your journey. You don't just start at a given point. And that past that we're leaving behind is really the consequence, on a psychological level, of our repressions, actually. Right? The concept of repression. Because repression is what then gives rise to the unconscious. And in psychological terms, the unconscious is the past. Or let's say the unconscious is defined as the place where its content, in other words, the content of the unconscious is made up of our repressions. It's the repository of our repressions. And it is from that past that we establish what we then call the future. Right? So this has a lot to do with the concept of time. So we can ask the question, is time really shadow time? Since our presence and our futures are articulated, connected to the fact that we've repressed and created this unconscious, which apparently psychologically, at least in the Freudian view, is a static place full of our repressions. The things we've had to repress because our peers didn't approve, or we learned not to approve about aspects of ourselves. And just by simple definition, if you map that process onto the timeline, it corresponds to the past. And we're ever moving into a hypothetical future. But as Jung so rightly said, that which you repress doesn't remain static or latent within the unconscious. In fact, it looms up on the road ahead of us. Because the strange thing that he claims that Freud forgot is that the more you repress something, the more alive you make it. This is just the way the energetics of consciousness are. This is just the way it plays itself out, energetically speaking. The more you repress something, the more that you'll meet with it on the path, a path ahead of you. So then we ask the question, is there really time at all? Since that which you thought was past is now going to be part of the future. How are we to think of that? Is time a straight line now? Is anything even permanent now? And then we can also take a Freudian view, which is very revealing. Because to become a human being, in fact, Freud said to have anything like we call civilization is based on this gap in time. You have to delay gratification, which originally when you're born, you're in the pleasure principle and you don't do that. But as you meet reality, and step into what he called the reality principle, or when the reality principle starts entering into you, you have to go through this process of delaying gratification. Some people do it better than others. And so for the child, the first instance is that time is an enemy, because it doesn't want to delay its gratification, it wants everything now. It's a magical child syndrome, it wants everything that it desires, it wants it now, craves it. And it rejects the reality. It rejects that kind of time, worldly time, and says, time, you're my enemy. But just as it's about to do that and convince itself to remain in the pleasure principle, even though time may be delayed, ultimately we do gain what we want, even though there's a gap. And so now time is a friend, because there was delayed gratification, but we did actually get what we wanted. We were gratified. So then the soul is sitting there thinking, well, just about to call time my worst enemy and flip out and regress and what have you. But now I realize that all you got to do is accept this process and work slowly towards what you want. So we learn to wait and we to work gradually for what we desire. And this is then bringing us into sync with nature's laws and rules, and there's other benefits for doing that as well. And also we learn about our own limitations. We're not omnipotent beings, you see. And so there is a certain pleasure also from that, from going along to get along, obeying these rules. And there also then is the desire to not only discover that we have these limitations, we're not all omnipotent and powerful, but there's another desire to become that. And that's what art and science is. We want to overcome a limitation. This is something very, very special about the human being. He notices a couple of things about life, that disempower him, and the next thing he wants to do is to change that situation and overcome limitations. And that's where, as Freud said, civilization comes. Our science, our art, our whole ingenuity, our curiosity arises from that. Again, very articulated to what time is doing. Because all of this processes of perfection, just like the search for wholeness we just spoke about, is accomplished in time. Self-realization, in other words, is gained also through time. Now, the process of time, befores and afters, past, present, and future, we imagine that is delineated by the clock and by the divisions of the clock. So time and modern consciousness are very connected, deeply linked. In fact, some people might say even identical. And we said that the unconscious is deeply temporal because it contains that stuff that we don't want to remember and we throw into this repository. But it's a temporal repository. It's technically the past. Let's try to get hold of that picture very importantly. It refers to all that has come before, right? So we can forget about it. And as I said, there's some people who like to do that better than others, but there you are. It's the psychic graveyard, or the underground museum, so to speak. But the thing is that the act of repression occurs now. So even though you're saying that the content of the unconscious represents a yesterday and a shadow realm, the actual acts of dissociation are current. They happen in the present. So again, there's an overlap. We repress instinctively, right? Repression is not something we know we're doing consciously. It happens as we're seeking our desires. Doesn't matter if those desires are salvation, spiritual salvation, self-realization, or some much lesser, more mundane goal. It happens anyway. But the thing is, as Jung pointed out, that the content of the unconscious starts to affect and even disaffect our process. Right? It influences our desire. It doesn't remain static, and it colors the present. Imagine, for instance, imagine that repression is similar to, in Jung's context, of just loading your pockets full of stones, heavy, heavy stones. Isn't that going to affect your walk into the future? And the more you laden yourself down, the more you stagger, the more you feel weighted, the more you could completely hurt yourself. And then, while you're lying at the side of the road in agony, your future desires are not going to change, aren't they? So again, we thought what we were repressing and putting into the past had no effect on the process, but actually it deeply affects the process. Now we're going into this because time is a very great mystery. Scientists today admit that time is one of the greatest puzzles of all. And so it's a mystery of itself. But it's so deeply articulated to consciousness and what consciousness is doing. In a way, we find that it's rather than a straight line, which is how we like to think of time and how we like to think of our journey. There's something else going on. Past, future, and present are all moving together like a sort of a wave pattern. They seem to walk together, blending. And ultimately, as philosophers like John McTaggart and others have thought, maybe our whole concept of time is an illusion, an unreality. And in the previous program, we were looking specifically at the Hierophant, but it included the Emperor too. We saw how closely religion and time go hand in hand. Right? The rise of the solar powers and this fixed routines, the fixed clock. After all, the first clocks we even knew were on cathedrals and church towers. The first bells that rang through the day were in monasteries, and they rang so that villagers got used to hearing it. It was actually just for the monks. right? That's where it's for these religious types. But the villagers almost unconsciously start hearing it. They start to organize their lifestyles around the ringing of these bells and their routines, and their whole relationship to the day and to time changed because of it. When we see on the Oswald Worth deck, the man stands at the junction of two roads. He can only choose one of them, right? And if he walks down one, it's like he can't walk the other. So here's the whole thing that Martin Heidegger also spoke about, that yeah, a lot of possibilities are open to us, but the moment that we select this or that possibility, 20 other possibilities are closed as well. So there's a strange paradox. We need choice, but our choice can also limit us as well as open us to everything. Another phenomenon about a path or a road that lies ahead of us is simply that who made that road? If that road is made out of the footsteps, just like an animal path, right? The constant movement of the animals along a path, and that's where the path came from. It didn't invent itself. So wait a minute, isn't there an inherent collectivism then involved in even walking a path? After all, I'm walking on a path formed by other people, carved out by others who've gone before. And don't I also have the choice then to walk exactly in their footsteps? Which means I'm not really walking as an individual. And isn't that what a lot of people are doing? And isn't the fact that they have carved the road out ahead of me the past? It's not the future. I'm the future. They're the past. Now in Jung's vernacular, those footprints, or the road that's made by others, he describes as the mythic realm, or the archetypal journey. We may be walking as individuals, but our world, our life, our ontogenetic life, parallels an archetypal mythic reality. They run hand in hand. This is also a fascinating concept. And Eric Newman helps us to understand what it's all about. He says, in the course of this ontogenetic, right, that's personal development, the individual ego consciousness has to pass through the same archetypal stages which determine the evolution of consciousness in the life of humanity. The individual has in his own life to follow the road that humanity has trod before him, leaving traces of its journey in the archetypal sequence of the mythological images. And that is why it's possible to walk and put your feet exactly in the footprints of others, and then you're living in their reality. You haven't really carved out your own. You may look like you are, but you're not. Or you can walk the road realizing, yeah, others may have carved this out. I didn't invent it, but I'm going to add something of my own to it. Now this is not to negate individualism, right? Because even our walking on the road helps to carve that road as well. And the road that we carve out or help to carve out, others will follow behind us. If we make a tool, isn't it obvious that others can use it in the future? So there's really no question of hard individualism in this world or hard anti-individualism. It's up to the person. So those roads represent that choice. Very important to realize this, that there are paths to tread, but we can tread them as an individual or not. But even beyond that, there is a confluence between those who've gone before, those who've made the road, and then the individualism of our own footfall, our own tread. It just is a matter of orientation, how you yourself, regard it and see it. You can have your focus on your own thing, and you can also have focus too much on the other thing, or you can blend them both together. The way to look at it is that the trunk of the tree and the branches, they're the individual manifestation, but there's also the roots, which is something that's gone before, something that's transpersonal, shall we say. So it's a give and take, an ebb and a flow and a call and response. And in many ways, we find that in our own daily lives. If you're in a band, it can be wonderful, but then there's also sometimes a desire for you to go your own ways. If you're a singer or a musician, say, I like the band format, but I really feel trapped in one way because I'd like to go and express totally and create totally from myself. It's a very strong drive. And this can even happen in a relationship setting, where you enjoy what it means to be in a relationship with someone, and there's a certain codependency, but that's pleasant. But then there's another urge. I don't want to feel trapped. Who would I be if I was with someone else, or who would I be if I was on my own? So again, that's what we're talking about. There's this individualism pattern or path, and then there's the concept of sharing and being with others and being related to the greater mythic archetypal journey that we contribute. We're also contributors to it.
Loving you isn't the right thing to do. How can I ever change things that I feel? If I could, maybe I'd give you my word. How can I if you won't take it from me? You can go your own way, go your own way. You can call it another lonely day. You can go your own way, go your own way. Tell me why everything turned around. Packing up, checking up, saw you wanna do. If I could, maybe I'd give you my word. Open up, everything's waiting for you. You can go your own way, go your own way. You can call it another lonely day. You can go your own way, go your own way. You can call it another lonely day. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Now, the esoteric letter assigned to this card is Zayin, spelled Z-A-I-N. It's an ancient Phoenician letter, very similar to our Z, and of course implies a lightning flash, which is interesting. But in the esoteric tradition, that letter Zayin is connected to the phallus, so again it masculinizes this card very much so. The symbol associated with Zayin is a sword, very similar to the Ace of Swords in the tarot card, in the minor arcana, that is. But a sword, Excalibur, what have you. And the sword also is a symbol of the intellect. It rules one of the Kabbalistic regions called Yetzirah, the realm of Yetzirah. But that's associated with air and also with intellect. And that correspondence is quite correct, because as we've been hinting and saying, this is a card that definitely relates to piercing through delusion, embodying contradictions, wondering whether there's a confluence between opposites, and just that simple ability to tell between truth and lies, good and evil. Especially the contradictions and delusions that exist within oneself that maybe bar the way to higher understanding. Remember in the book of Genesis, the angel, right? We have an angel here, Gabriel or whoever it might be. We have that story in Genesis of the angel with the sword, barring the way back to Eden, barring the way back to that wholeness. And the sword as a symbol we'll see again when we deal with Arcanum number 11. But the sword is important. We said it rules the intellect and discernment and all of that. But it also represents transcendence, the idea that humans are a transcendent being. Right? As we said, that's a sort of a fancy word, but the idea is really simple. We are the ones, human beings are the ones, who are above the animals in that sense, because we are thinkers, and we know ourselves as thinkers. We can even think about the fact that we're thinkers. We can think about thought. We have future conception and cognition. We can plan for the future. We know we're going to die, for instance, which animals never contemplate. You know, we sit and question the meaning of our lives, which animals do not do. In fact, we do that even if, you know, we've had all of our material needs met. We have enough money, we have shelter, we have food, we have warmth and all of those things. Even when all of the basic needs that the materialist atheists are so concerned with, right? But even when those are all met, there's this craving, there's this need to find something more. There is even in quite hedonic men, actually, that search for greater meaning. And that's all represented by the idea of a sword. And the ability to wield that sword. The skills of the mind. If we look at the astrology of it, the card, we discover that division is again emphasized, because this is the sign of Gemini. This card relates to the sign of Gemini. It's a mutable air sign, ruling intellect, communication, and thought. And the ruler of the sign of Gemini is Mercury. Right? We met him earlier in the form of Khonsu. Now it's Mercury. That's Hermes, Thoth, the gods of wisdom and communication. The god who has the winged feet. He can traverse the highest and the lowest. He has that ability to see things from a multiplicity of perspectives. In the actual constellation, it's the twins, Castor and Pollux, this syzygy. Again, suggesting man's inner division, conscious and unconscious, good and bad. Representing the different kinds of life. It's like Jekyll and Hyde, so to speak. In fact, it reminds me of the poster for the Matrix movie again, in which Neo is actually reflected as two people in the glasses of Morpheus. Right? Morpheus's sunglasses. You see this as he's reaching for the pills. But he's a duad. I don't know how many people have noticed that that's a very Geminian concept. Very similar to the Oswald Wirth deck. He's got two people here, two roads. And Morpheus himself is a version of Mercury, the psychopompus, the guide. He's a very similar role in that film as Anubis or Christ. You're checking back and referring subliminally, to and symbolically to these ancient motifs that are very, very well known. Hermes, in his guise of Thoth, actually initiated Isis. So it's almost turned around. We talked about the power of the goddess before, but it's almost like here, in one sense, the lunar god. Thoth initiated Isis, or helped her at least, like Anubis did. Anubis was her companion when she went around searching for the lost parts of Osiris, you see. So there's a assistance or help that's given. In fact, even Gemini, although the god Janus is usually connected with January, the closing of the previous year and the opening of the new one, this particular point of Gemini also could be symbolized in a way by the god Janus of the two faces, the kind of polarity of looking back and looking forward. And it's a halfway stage is certainly emphasized because Gemini is halfway up the first part of the spring arch, right? The whole arch goes from Aries to Libra, right? But halfway to the zenith of midsummer, Gemini is halfway. So it represents a halfway point. As I said, the Tarot people knew what they were doing. The sun has moved halfway up the arch. A very important junction for the ancients. In fact, the Milky Way, which was the river of life, another hypothetical pathway or road, right, was considered the Milky Way, the road of the gods, the road of the pharaoh, begins between the signs of Taurus and Gemini. Then you have reference to the Minotaur, this beast that has to be overcome as the hero matures, tests his mettle. We've been talking about that, testing one's mettle. Minotaur is purely astrotheological. Minotaur. Gemini, Taurus. The end of Gemini and the beginning of the word Taurus. This is how the ancient mythicists did it. To represent something astrological, but it's psychological as well. The overcoming of a particular stage. Astrologically, astrotheologically, right, it's the age of Gemini. Not just the sign of Gemini, but the age of Gemini, over 6,000 years ago. And it's interesting that this image appears. It might not be my preferred image, but it could symbolize something important, because this enmity that's implicit in this card between the masculine and the feminine, was it in the age of Gemini 6,000 years ago that something happened between the sexes? Was it in the age of Gemini that the actual story that has come down to us of the Garden of Eden and two trees and all of the symbolism that goes with that, the serpent and the angel with a sword and what have you, was that story conceived 6,000 years ago? Is that what the tarot is trying to tell us here? Or was there some actual schism between the sexes? Fascinating to contemplate that. And if we look at the Kabbalistic correspondences, we earlier saw that there is a correspondence when we looked at the Oswald Wirth deck of the two women representing the Ein and the Ein Sof. That was interesting. But in the Rider-Waite deck, you can see that the figures are actually laid out like what is known as the supernal triangle. So at the top of the Kabbalistic tree of life, the first three Sephiroth there kind of correspond a little bit, where even the male and female here could even be the two pillars actually on either side. And the angel then might be a personification of the central pillar, which is known as the pillar of equilibrium, the pillar of balance. Right? Or the two figures just simply represent Bina and Chokmah, with Kether being at the top. And that could be because the numbers of those Sephira, 1, 2, and 3, equal 6, which is the number of this card. And 6, as we've said before, represents the hexagram, the unity, the opposites coming together. In the two-tree system that we've been using, we find that this card, number 6, which represents Tifereth, also on the second tree represents this card, 17, the star. And it's interesting that in this card we see two urns or vessels. And interestingly, that is exactly how the Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, right, the 10 or 11 Sephiroth, were often represented or pictorialized as chalices, or grail cups almost. Not containing liquid, but containing light. And you can see this if you go to the card in the minor arcana known as the 10 of Cups. You'll see the Kabbalistic tree. This isn't a Thoth deck. You'll see that the artist has laid out the 10 Sephiroth as chalices. So interesting and beautiful imagery there. And last time when we did the Hierophant, we saw that Gebura was the place where the light was so intense that the pot cracked. Something happened there where the light of God cracked. Proved to be unstable, with light overflowing, threatening to even destroy the pot. That was why also the 5 cards, if you take out all of the number 5 cards in the minor arcana, they're associated with imbalance and difficulty. And so the message there is that the light, the energy, and the flesh, the clay, must be in balance. One can't overdo the other. The sword should not split the sheath, so to speak. But this card certainly is nicer than the Tower, and it represents a return to relative balance after a period of chaos. You know, after the whirlwind and the struggle, there is a rebirth, a return to order, a creative period following a period of dejection or even tragedy. After a dark night of the soul, after a period when one loses their faith, there can be a period of renewal of faith and hope and understanding, of course. After falling into temptation and sin, there is a contrition and redemption, just like you might see in the book of Job, that story in the Bible, in the Old Testament. But absolutely, Tifereth, the 6th zone of the Tree of Life, is always associated. This Sephirah is associated with solar heroes. That's why we see the sun. This is a correct depiction here of the angel and the sun, representing those solar heroes, solar children such as Horus and Sir Galahad, also Jesus, of course. And psychologically, it's the zone of the self, of selfhood, backing up what we've been talking about. Now when it comes to the deeper mystical meaning of this card, card number 6, there's several things that needs to be established. First of all, we talked about individuality and the positing of individuality, being set off against the things of the world and against the people of the world, the beings and the entities. You know, each person is set off against everything else. There's the I am and there's the you are. And that positing of selfhood is a daily occurrence, minute by minute. Every day you have to do it. In order for me to even note your existence, it's implied that I am positing my selfhood. As for you to notice my selfhood, my existence, you are constantly, you couldn't know about me, you couldn't think of anyone in front of you until you've posited your own beingness, your beinghood. And it's almost like selfhood is a product of selfhood. Selfhood is creating that. You can't get behind selfhood. Even in a dream state, it is still the dreamer is there. And selfhood makes relevant everything else that I do or think. Another thing to establish is the journey-like quality of this card. He is, in a way, at least in the Oswald Worth rendition, setting off on some sort of journey. Something is happening. Or on a journey, he's found himself at a particular junction point. And when it comes to journeys, the whole of life then is a journey. Yeah. And a journey can imply a goal as well. Now, this is very important to get this, because there's the journey and there's the supposed goal. But do the two really go together? Because on deeper investigation, we find that the seeking impulse is fundamental or ontological. And the goal is almost secondary. Ontologically speaking, that means fundamental. I mean, absolutely intrinsic to our being is the whole idea of searching for something. Seeking. We are doers. As a matter of fact, the word mind, believe it or not, was not a noun. The word mind, originally, if you go back and look at the etymology, it was a verb. It implied a process of doing. It wasn't a thing at all. It was a process, an active process. So relevant to what we're talking about here and teasing out. Does this mean then that goals per se are just working illusions? A convenient premise? That they are indeed secondary or derivative? The main thing about being human is the seeking, and it's really irrelevant what it is. You could be seeking for ultimate meaning and enlightenment or Godhead, well, the other guy's searching for the perfect set of stamps. He's after the perfect set of football cards. He's after some award or trophy. He's looking to be the dean of a college or the president of a country. Is the goal really that important? Because once he's found that goal, doesn't he immediately go on? He doesn't stop, does he? He goes on to seek for something else. Can there be an end then? Well, according to Nietzsche, no, there'd be no question of an end. Man is an eternal seeker. The very nature of the psyche is to inquire. It's restless. It pulls apart. That's science. And it brings together. That's metascience or metaphysics. We tend to say, on our journey, we want to overcome obstacles. But maybe something else is going on that accounts for the conflicts in life. Those obstacles bar us from attaining our goal, right? But if we're really seekers and the goal is not important, then what are those obstacles all about? Maybe we designed it so that we have goals and obstacles. Maybe we designed it that conflict in not only one individual's life, but in the whole existence of humanity are nothing more than collateral damage while we pursue the hunt. Are we lovers of the hunt? Is that what it's all about? Just the simple act of hacking through the forests, the tangled forests? That in itself is an end in itself? Are we playing hide and seek? And that hidden part of us, the unconscious, now we understand what that's about? It's an act of sleight of hand. We're doing it to ourselves. I mean, this would answer a great deal, by the way, if you actually think about it. So is this a cosmic game that we're playing with ourselves? Kind of game of chess? Look at the fool. Look at that up-tilted head. This guy can't wait to get on the road. Is he really looking for a goal? Or is just the momentum? Is the whole thing that he is nothing but a seeker? And no matter what turning he takes or vista, whatever environment he finds himself in, whatever landscape, that too will pass. He'll continually move on. Could this answer why it is that the ultimate answers to the universe, to the meaning of life, these things are elusive? Well, they are elusive. Why are they elusive? History appears to be nothing more than a question-making enterprise or process. We ask questions that lead us to some answers, but then we ask, that leads to yet more questions. Most of which, or some of which, a great many of which, are actually insoluble. Whether we're asking about the beginnings of time, the beginnings of the universe, the ending of the universe, the nature of time, the nature of freedom, who is God, what about free will? Questions, yeah, down through history, on and on and on. Now some people, some of you watching will refute that. They'll say, oh no, there's a goal, all right. It's always, the goals are important. It's not just about seeking. I mean, it's impossible to be seeking unless there is a goal. It defeats the purpose. So there has to be a goal. Otherwise, we're just thrashing around aimlessly. You're talking about just returning to the place of beginning then, if the journey has no vertical premise to it, no goals. It becomes a mockery. That's what Schopenhauer thought, Arthur Schopenhauer. It's just the will, aimlessly moving. Goals be damned. It's just, one day this is the reality, the next day it's something else. It's just a mindless will moving everlastingly onward. But those who believe that the goal is important will say, oh, but in the end, you see, the seeker goes and seeks the ultimate. He's bound to do this, because lesser attainment whets the appetite. When we have reached certain lower goals, that inspires us to seek higher goals. And we know that we have a good chance of attaining those. Lower successes or simple successes inspire us to bigger aspirations. That's what it's all about. Or maybe we are seeking something that is truly missing. So the limited perspective can see it just as a sort of a game. But it can't be that, says another side of us. And even if we fail to gain what we want, that's only because the thing is elusive. I'm not to blame for the obstacles that came up that prevented me from getting to my goal. I can't do anything about that, but I did want that thing. So it's not a question of failure. Failure is built into it. It's a problem. But it's not me playing any game. That's just the way things are. So again, the main point of this is that there's two paths. There's the path of man as just a seeker, pure and simple. And there's man as the seeker of an actual goal. Which one do we choose? Which one do we think is important? It's a fundamental duplexity. If the goals are important, then they're important. We have to attain them. They're definite. They're important. If it's the seeking, well, then that tells us a lot of, might answer a lot of other very, very deep, pernicious metaphysical questions. And as we said, there's the road that's walked ahead of us by other people. And then there's the road we ourselves walk alone. Now, in the mystical tradition, these two roads that we're kind of talking about here, they're known by two terms we want to share with you. So-sein and Dasein. And we need to spend some time analyzing these two terms. They're very important, because each of us walks one of these roads, one of these paths.
If there's a bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. It's just a sprinkling for the May Queen. Yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. And it makes me wonder,
Now, before we proceed to analyze these terms, let's just clarify what we've learned previously. That is in the previous programs. When we looked at the Hierophant, we dismissed the Gnostic and religious ideas that the world is a cage of souls. Right? We kind of dismissed that. And we questioned whether there is even these hard dualisms that are so key to orthodoxy. William Blake, remember he said, without contraries there can be no progress. Maybe we need them. There's an incredible dynamism between what we think of as opposites. And earlier we said there is the circle of unity holding these things together. When we looked at the Emperor and the Hierophant, we took the point of view that any kind of supernaturalisms, any kind of metaphysics is just the result of being indoctrinated basically by anti-natural pathological creatures who occupy the thrones of the world and who have a great deal to gain by keeping us, you see, in a state of profound ignorance and discomfiture and psychic and physical impotency. In the previous program we also doubted whether a God as presented by religion, right, could even exist. And if he did exist, he must be a very dualistic being. We find nothing but dualisms within and dualisms without. Remember that whole thing about God, if he's the creator, he must also be the destroyer? The attempts to explain that and reconcile that dichotomy in God's nature are utterly infantile. We simply can't account for evil rationally unless we accept that God is its creator. And we also, by citing people like Alvin Boyd Kuhn, we showed that it's just unacceptable, ludicrous, to believe that the senses are not giving us accurate information about a reality. Is another important feature of religion. Central to a lot of theology and to even some mystical beliefs, you see, that we don't have certain knowledge. And of course this is contradicted, as we showed, by people like Martin Heidegger and by Merleau-Ponty and Schelling and others, who talk about us being so deeply, just like roots in the soil. You know. It's ludicrous to talk about these hard subject-object dichotomies. We're very rooted and embedded in our world on a very, very deep, intimate level. And now in this program we can proceed, and it'll be a little bit softer than that, and take on board or entertain some of the ideas that are common to some mystical traditions, some found within Christianity, early Christianity, but also in Gnosticism or Neoplatonism, Manichaeanism, Hermetic science, Hermetic groups. Bearing in mind always that most of mystical traditions have been contaminated down through the decades and the centuries. Contaminated by mystics who drastically altered the original tenets of mysticism. And we bear in mind that those distortions, those contaminations, are very serious and very dangerous as well, once they're embodied. Well, we'll present here an uncontaminated account of what the mystical tradition is, and see how it's relevant to this this discussion of not only this card, but the whole of the major arcana and the path of the Fool. We can also question as we go, not only about the hard dualisms, but whether there is really, as a lot of theology states, is there a war or conflict between God and Satan, or good and evil? Now, for mystics such as Justin Martyr, Jacob Bohm, Meister Eckhart, and later Emanuel Swedenborg, there is really one major dualism, and that is the one that exists between God's essential nature and man's nature. Right? This is core dualism that they see as a problem. And other dualisms, such as that between, say, spirit and matter, or the world and the supernatural realms, or male and female, these can all be resolved and understood once man merges back with Godhead. There are mysteries, they say. Mysteries of time, mysteries of being, mysteries of spirit and matter and whatever. But those will be resolved once man merges back into God's being then those will be explained. Now the mystic might stand up and say, well, wait a minute, according to these theologians and Gnostics, we're already in the fallen world. So anything that you're going to think of or conceive or mentalize while you're down there in that realm of darkness is going to be a lot of hogwash, isn't it? Because you're already in the broken world. You're already in the fallen world. So even, what validity does it have? Any of your concepts about God and what God might be, or any of it, any of the metaphysical things that religion has thrown up in 2,000 years and more, is the product of, by your own definition, the product of a fallen consciousness. What's the answer to that? The answer is simply that, look, there are men who've gone ahead of us, who've broken through, who've seen the light, right? The Eckharts, the Swedenborgs, the Blakes. They went ahead and they know more than we do. And so we accept that they're telling us the truth about God's nature. We have that to refute the skeptic, the hard skeptic. We're not in Meister Eckhart's presence. We didn't know the man. We've no way of knowing even if he was really right and wrong, but in the darkness there's that light. And we can also do as he asked, do as he stipulated, which is go within. Because the message of all mystics is to go within. Do as he did and go within. Of course, the skeptic can also say that, look, God, can't be dualistic. I mean, the world, the creation is the result of God. So how could God get it wrong? How could the creation be so flawed? How did evil even get here? How did evil come into being, if God was involved? Even if it was an aspect of human existence, wouldn't God come in to fix it? Wouldn't he do something about it? And so intelligent men of our modern world tend to see evil as a purely human, construct, a human phenomenon. And many skeptics are even of the opinion that any kind of internal looking, any kind of self-investigation or internal mystic enterprises are just spurious. Wow. There's no value in looking within. Man got into those mystical beliefs because he was scared of the world. It's fear of the external that threw him into the so-called inner environment. That's solipsism. That's just neurosis. That's just, the world's a threatening place. And so as a refuge from that, all this mystical mumbo-jumbo came into being. It's not really worth doing. It's not of any consequence. Well, of course, you could say that that's demonstrably false as well. Because the contemplative men of the world, those who have looked within, tend to be the best that humanity has produced. Are they not? They're the world's best specimens. They're the least likely to commit harm to other people, and they're the most creative. They've given us so much beauty. They're the literati. They're the ones who've been improving our world. If we didn't have them, think what the world would really be like. So how can it be just... How can these people be doing what they're doing out of fear of the world? Do they look like that? Do they look like men who are afraid of the world? Does Emerson look like a man who is afraid of the world? These are the people who've drawn our attention to the majesty and the beauty of all things. Consider Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Shelley, and Thomas Hardy and Emerson, as I said, and Hölderlin and Rilke and so on. And the skeptic, we hinted about this earlier, the skeptic jumps up and says, well, there's nothing in consciousness that isn't of the world. Even if you think of an island of ice cream cones, that's a composite of things that exist in the world. Ice cream cones exist in the world, and so do islands. You just put them together. A winged horse, Pegasus, but that's things that exist in the world, wings and horses. You just join them together in your imagination. It all originates in the world external to us. So mental content is really worldly content. That's why I'm an atheist. But the thing is, yeah, everything in the mind of the individual, but is that self who's thinking about all that mental concept or content? That being wasn't put together by the world. There's one who benefits from all of that interjection. That's the self. And that self is very real because it's intuiting the difference between mental concepts and worldly concepts. You forgot about that. Yeah, it's mental concepts. It's mental furniture. abstracted from the world. But who tells the difference between those two realities? Who occupies both houses? Right? As a human being, you occupy the world of objects, and you also occupy the inner world. That's a tenant, occupying two mansions. Very special status. As we said, man, the transcendent being with a transcendent quality. And so it is this that gives mystics the right to conceive of man as something more than just the sum of the parts. But of course, this leads us to really leads us to ask, what is the mystical way really all about then? Does it lead anywhere at all? To answer this, we have to understand that even when it comes to mysticism, there's an exoteric school and an esoteric school. We talked about it's been contaminated, and we have to also realize that there's two quite different schools. And that the mystics' creed is slightly different than that which we'd associate with Orthodox believers and spiritualists. Now, primarily mystics vehemently reject the picture of man, of God and of spirit that is favored by Orthodox schools of religion. Those schools often picture man as a lowly creature, as a sinner, a disobedient sinner, and that his only hope of salvation lies in strict obedience to God, or more precisely, his ministers. And we looked at the downsides of this in previous programs. Key to the mystical tradition is the belief in inner work, internal work, leading to personal revelations and personal insights. This is a tradition that dates back to Justin Martyr, to Meister Eckhart, Jacob Bohm, and even at earlier periods, maybe Pythagoras in the West, but some sages, not all sages in the East. And the mystic holds that without this internal work, there's no chance of reaching Godhead at all. No possibility of uniting with God. And we can already see that that's quite personalistic as opposed to collectivistic. The very mention of internal work at all. And the mystic, therefore, doesn't have any time for creeds with their dogmas and their doctrines that everyone must follow, without question. And therefore, any kind of priesthoods and their churches are just inconsequential to this work, this inner work. Importantly also is the rejection of imposed morality, the codes and virtues, all of that, that's imposed by these emperors and hierophants. In fact, in the case of the hierophant, from a Kabbalistic point of view, he occupies the pillar of severity. And the pillar of severity. Think of the story of Jesus. The emperor, Pontius Pilate, representative of the emperor anyway, and symbolically the emperor, he forgives Jesus. He goes, I'm washing my hands. I don't find fault in this guy. It's the Sanhedrin of the priests that condemned Jesus, who represents the Spirit. Very important to consider that. Not only is internal work important to the mystics, but so is the whole concept of purification, purgation. Card 17. One must be cleansed, their intellect, their motives and intentions must be clean. In other words, man must be noble. The man who even desires to seek for God must have a certain nobility. I refer to that kind of person in other work as a morally superior being. A being whose nobility lies in the fact that he does not bow his knee or his head to anything or anyone else, including God. This is the nut of the mystical tradition. The head and the knee is simply not bowed to anything or anyone. The moment that you do that, you cease to be on the mystical path. Attendant to that is the whole concept of higher and lower. This is rejected. One may loosely use these terms, but ultimately, in the purest sense, these are concepts that are mysterious. They're talismanic. They don't have any meaning, and they're dangerous. As we said, that true mystics will not endorse those terms. And we might also add that Gnosticism in general is not the same as what existed in the world at the time of the Druids or the pre-Vedic. They're not consistent with true Aryan teachings. The Gnostic view is anti-natural, world-denying. And Aryans and Druids, of course, were very pantheistic. Gnostics do believe that you reach God by deeply, abstracting from the body and the world, being suspicious of the body and the world. Now, they may cover that up and window dress it so you don't quite get that, but, you only have to study Mani of the Manichaeans to see what I'm talking about. To the Gnostics, both are considered fallen. And the universe that we know, the universe that we occupy, is really the creation of a demiurge. There's that word again, demiurge. Rex Mundi. And this demiurge is himself imperfect. He may think of himself as God, but he's not the real God. He's imperfect. And he's created an imperfect world. We've already met him in the form of Blake's Eurism. But the interesting thing about this is that mystics consider this Gnostic or the Gnostics do as well, and many mystics consider this demiurgic figure to be identical with Jehovah, the God of the Jews, the God of Christianity. A wrathful being, a wrathful deity, who, as I said, is not the true God. According to the mystic tradition, this demiurgic figure created the forms of the world, the material stuff of the world, but he has no control over the light or the energy that makes that creation possible. That's in the hands of a greater being. We have the spark of that greater being. Remember our opening quote? We have the spark, Meister Eckhart's spark that he spoke of the true divinity within us. And it is that spark that pulls us to another reality, that makes seekers out of us, that makes us realize that something's not all right, say the Gnostics. We're not totally comfortable here in the world. And that's where that impulse that we talked about earlier, to seek. That's why we went into all of that. Because the impulse to seek for something is the spark of that higher imperial being, trying to coax us out of this imperfect region, which is full of crime, immorality, injustice, imbalance, ignorance, and spiritual vacuity. That's what the Gnostics and some mystics are going to point to, saying, do you get it? When we talk about this world being imperfect, good is going unrewarded, and the tyrant dies peacefully in his luxurious bed, evil going unpunished. Do you get it? Can you face that fact and see what we're talking about? Many mystics insist that it should be obvious to any reader that the God of the Old Testament, the God of Judeo-Christianity, is simply not the same as the God of Jesus. That there's been sleight of hand at work here. I mean, it should be obvious that this wrathful creature who banishes Adam and Eve and brings and wraps up the creation, brings about the deluge, is hardly the same being as the one that Jesus is talking about. These are the kind of mystics who would argue that the kind of Jehovah-centered theology isn't original. It's not even the original form of Christianity, actually. There's an earlier form of Christianity, and that was hijacked and subverted by agents and apologists of this whole Mosaic, Abrahamic Judaism, is what they talk about. And they have quite a strong case, actually. And these are the ones who are the sorcerers, these agents of the false religion. They wanted the Old Testament to be connected to the New. So the Bible you have is actually the product of these servants of the demiurge, you see. To mystics, it's the Old Testament that's the poison that needs to be taken out. And it's the book that deceives good Christians. We have to bear this in mind, especially when we're thinking of people like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and all sorts of other people who almost swear by the Old Testament more than they do, to the New. These are the ones who believe that, man is so poisonous, man is so sinful, that there has to be intermediaries. But what they're really doing is they're presenting us with a God so wrathful that man as man can't even come in front of that being. He needs popes and priests and God knows what to come in the way. Well, what kind of God is that? Why do we need to be forgiven of our sins in this way? Now, the mystic says to awaken is to step beyond all dogmas of that kind, you see, and contact the intelligence of the heart. That's that spark. But again, that can't happen, they say, until there's a certain amount of mental and spiritual purification. And that can only be attained when there's first the deep introspection. Because no one else can tell us where our faults lie on that level. No one can discern where our own personal internal weaknesses are, those obstacles that may stand between us and the real. And so this difference, these differences that define a mystic, you'll often find that the mystic is often a noted heretic or a noted libertine, because he's just simply not conforming to these imposed morals and values, which are just ways to abase human beings, you see. And as I said, they insist that the teachings of Jesus, when they're really understood, are mystical in nature, right? I repeat that. The teachings of Jesus are mystical. They direct you towards your inner house. And Christians don't know that because there's been sleight of hand and contamination. These original teachings have been obscured by the false Mosaic, Judaic dogmatists. And their agents. Mystics frown upon St. Paul, you see, and Marcion and St. Augustine particularly, and other church fathers, suppressing the teachings of Jesus, suppressing the apocryphal works, suppressing the Gnostic Gospels of Thomas and Judas, and excising important books from the Bible and so on. Really being disciples of an ancient, primitive tradition. These old, outmoded Judaic laws and ways. They're just sorcerers worshipping their demiurge. And it's these people who've given rise not only to Christianity of the wrathful kind, but also, as I said, to these other cults like Jehovah's Witness and the Mormons. There's actually sorcery behind it, okay? That's what the mystics believe.
So, as Bob was pointing out, I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which, as you all know, is in it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, which creates certain interesting moments in teaching historical approaches toward early Christianity and the New Testament. This last year I was teaching my course on the New Testament, so I had a class of about 360 students in it, and I decided to do something this last year that I had never done before. I began my class by asking students the following question. I said, how many of you in here would agree with the proposition that the Bible is the inspired Word of God? Boom! The entire room raises its hand. All right, good, great. Now, how many of you have read the Da Vinci Code, I asked? Boom! The entire room raises its hand. Oh, good, okay. Now, how many of you have read the entire Bible? Scattered hands. I said, all right. Now, I'm not telling you that I think God wrote the Bible. You're telling me that you think God wrote the Bible. I can see why you might want to read a book by Dan Brown. I mean, if God wrote a book, wouldn't you want to see what he had to say? It's just one of the mysteries of living in the South. Well, the Bible is the most widely purchased, most thoroughly revered, and probably most broadly misunderstood book in the history of human civilization. One of the things that's misunderstood, at least by my 19-year-old students at Chapel Hill, is that when we're reading the Bible, we're not actually reading the words of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We're reading translations from the Greek language in which these books were written. And something is always lost in translation. And not only that, but we're not reading translations of the originals of these books, because we don't have the originals of these books or of any of the other books of the New Testament. What we have are copies made centuries later, many of them many, many centuries later. These thousands of copies that we have are all different from one another in lots of little ways, and sometimes in big ways. There are places where we don't know what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote. Now, for some Christians, that's not a problem because they don't have a high view of Scripture. For others, it's a very big problem. What does it mean to say that God inspired the words of the text if we don't have the words? Moreover, why should one think that God performed the miracle of inspiring the words of the Bible if he didn't perform the miracle of preserving the words of the Bible? If he meant to give us his very words, why didn't he make sure we received them? The problem of not having the originals of the New Testament, though, is a problem for everyone, not simply for those who believe that the Bible was inspired by God. For all of us, I think, the Bible is the most important book in the history of Western civilization. It continues to be cited in public debates over gay rights, abortion, over whether to go to war with foreign countries, over how to organize and run our society. But how do we interpret the New Testament? It's hard to know what the words of the New Testament mean if we don't know what the words were.
And some mystic thinkers, some mystics, are inclined to believe that organizations such as Freemasonry and Templarism are less dogmatic. They might look upon those organizations as less antagonistic. That their God is a God that is more acceptable, you see, to the mystic view. Whether that's true or not is a whole other subject. But just in general, most mystics await the destruction of both Catholicism and Protestantism, any kind of orthodoxy that is responsible for collectivizing the world, for forcing men into hive mentality, indoctrinating false doctrines deeply insinuating aberrant ideas about man, cosmos, and God. The mystics say that Jesus was indeed a savior, that his destiny was to enter into our reality despite the control of the demiurge, to come as an agent of order, to bring back a sense of order, to help kindle that spark. And as a result of doing that, he paid the ultimate price. He was crucified by the agents of the demiurge, the emperor and the hierophant, as we said. And therefore the mystic holds that the true God, the imperial God, who created the energy from which things are made, and simply cannot be contacted by anybody who subscribes to traditional religious beliefs. Because those have been custom-made, designed for toxic masses who have no intention of doing one, remember, internal work or internal purification. They're disqualified right away. That God is only realizable, contactable by the pure and the noble in spirit, those who've walked the mystic Siddhartha road. Importantly though, to such mystics, there's no concept of merging oneself in God. There's another thing that has to be rejected. On the contrary, selfhood is exalted. Right? In the orthodox path, and even in many traditions in the East, the self is lost. One is absorbed completely into the Godhead. That's the Judaic model, where man is absorbed into the object of his desire. But to the mystic, this is nonsense. Immortality is not a bestowal in the first place. You are immortal. You cannot not be immortal. It's something you are ontologically, pure and simple. Key to the mystical path is also the question of intuition. Right, we see this a lot in William Blake, who referred to imagination. Now that's just simply the knowledge of the heart. It includes reason, but it's bigger than reason. It's a totality of consciousness that involves emotion, moods, intellect, and so on. And that knowledge of the heart must, as we saw in the Rider-Waite version, here's the female, attuned to that higher state. Right? Once you have the intuition, represented by the female, then that intuition must remain attuned to the guidance of God. It's the knowledge of the heart, but it's only found in men who are free. It can't be found in anyone who's under any kind of dogmatic leash. In fact, they hold that this knowledge of the heart, or this spark, is the very thing that does the cleansing. Having it leads you to the next step. Once that's kindled and lit, right, intuition leads you to the next step. You can trust it. But the whole process is, as we saw before, ideographic, not nomothetic, ideographic. And it's again a concept that's completely at odds with the belief of these rival schools. One thing that these rival schools do is that they always present salvation as a goal at the end of a particular process. To mystics, this is another fiction. The process of self-realization and God-realization never ends. It's something of eternity. It's something of the crooked roads of imagination, not the straight roads of invention. Becoming doesn't terminate. It's a process that goes on and on eternally. And so mystics reject the cosmogony espoused by conventional schools of Judaism and Christianity. Those schools hold that the universe itself had a beginning and an end. I mean, mystics don't reject that, they laugh at it. There never was a beginning or end of the creation. The creation is embodied in man, and it's also embodied in God. Both man and God are an embodiment of the perfection and the order of the universe. And the existence of one is not dependent on the other. Therefore, what this does is it makes God and man ontologically equal in a very specific way. The mystics would say, to make it simple, what good is having all of this creation if there's no one there to observe it, to marvel at it, to awe at it? And this is what God and man share in common. So to them, God is not the creator of the creation. He's its creation, like man is its creation. And the dualism between man and God ends when we see God and man both as venerators, right? Embodying the awe, awe of the creation. So we could say that the mystic sees that God and man are creations of creation. Both of them are creations of creation. Of course, what this does is it rejects the idea that God created something out of nothing. That very pesky philosophical, metaphysical problem. Mystics don't see it as a problem because they've got things around the right way. So you can imagine now, you can see that what has been rejected is this concept of higher versus lower. That's trashed right away, right? Creation from nothing, that's trashed, right? These are spurious concepts, and they're mental mysteria. Also, another thing that goes with it, into the trash, is the whole concept of original sin. Because think what that does for a human being's psychology in the first place, right? Well, in one instance, the religious person is telling us that we're unique and we're God's creations, but the next breath they're telling us we're lower than you can possibly imagine. We're sinners. And the sin is even born out of crime, which we really didn't even know was a crime. But what is this doctrine of original sin? It's the doctrine that puts you down here and God up there. The higher and the lower again sneaks back in. You see, God is morally perfect. Man is fragile and inferior. Now, God destroyed the creation, but that's not a sin. He's sinless, even though he does something infinitely worse than what Adam and Eve did. But that doesn't make God a sinner. It's man who's the sinner through and through. Well, this is the master versus slave relationship, that is totally rejected by mystics. It's got no part of their creed. And that whole concept of the wrathful God is rejected. That is the creation of barbaric, primitive-minded, toxic Oriental races. There's nothing to do with the original concept that was pervaded in the West and which the teachings of Jesus were meant to embody. It's that dogma, that false religious dogma that says, oh, have faith, but decoded what it really means is, you have faith in my faith. I've got the faith, so you have faith in my faith. And we do it. The mystic path is to have faith in nothing. Have faith in no one. Don't listen to anybody else, what they do or they don't do. You go contact it for yourself. You find it or not find it yourself. Certain mystical paths don't even buy into the idea that God is even male to begin with. Groups like the Sethians, the Gnostic group, conceived of God as an androgynous being. Very key to the image of the card in the Oswald Wirth, this lover character with his arms crossed. Is he an androgynous being? But as we said, the mystic does not believe in merging with the Godhead in the way that's been presented to us. At the stage where one comes to the Godhead, both beings benefit. God benefits from the action and man benefits from the action. You have to start thinking about that. It can be described as like man is the tributary. His waters flow into the greater river, but both are strengthened. Right? The river that flows into the ocean. From one perspective, the ocean is greater, but the ocean isn't greater because it's the sum of all those rivers and their water. So how can it be greater? That's lunacy. That's the limited perspective. Each tributary, each river has added to the ocean's majesty and power. So the concept is neutralized about greater and lesser and higher and lower. If God is good, then God has grown stronger. Order has triumphed over disorder. And as we read in the opening quote, for the wisest of mystics, God is nothing but order. In fact, the term for God technically was logos, which means order. And order is rational. Order is visible to the senses, as anything could be. Right? The atheist and the materialist scientist can see God everywhere they look. What did you think? It was hidden? You might not realize that what you're looking at is God, but you're looking at God when you look at order, because God and order are one. That's what the mystic has understood. And that order, that logos, is embodied. It's actually higher than God. Actually, technically, the wisest mystics realize that the order is the order, and that order gave rise to God and man. Those beings are manifestations of the supernal order. But now that man is the embodiment of that order, he can dissent from that order. Right? This was brought out and explained beautifully by J.R.R. Tolkien in his book The Silmarillion, of how that process takes place, how that spiritual declination might occur. Now, as we saw in the opening quote, the road towards this salvation, or this Godhead, actually requires a dual action. That spark, what does it do? The spark that takes us back to the truth. Yeah, that spark is there to be employed to dispel disorder and bring order or goodness. But it must be within oneself first. So the first action is that the spark helps to cleanse one's own disorder, right? And then once that being is at that level of perfection and purity, they move on. The spark moves them to go on to create order in the world, to then combat the greater disorder. So it's dual action. But the opening quote also showed us that there can be no question then of a return to the Godhead unless that spark has done its work, unless that purification exists. No question of returning until that spark has done its work, both internally and externally. So, like we asked earlier, is there really a conflict between good and evil? To mystics, there is indeed a conflict between good and evil. Or shall we say more correctly, between ignorance and wisdom. As Blake said, ask me not whether a man is good or evil. Tell me only, is he a wise man or a fool? Because ignorance is the mother of all evil. And so the mystic view is this: to know anything, to know something, to know God, for instance, is actually, one could say, for argument's sake, that is to be greater than that thing that is known, because I'm the knower. I am the one who set out to seek it. And then when I get to know it, because of that stance that we spoke about earlier, that separation, I am the knower, so I'm embodying that thing within me. Therefore, I am technically greater than it, because I am myself, and I now know that thing. But that changes if the thing that I'm knowing, i.e. God, is also a self doing the same thing and knowing me. Please try to follow this. That means now that God, in knowing who I am, is doing the same thing. And therefore I cannot be greater than He, because our two greatnesses cancel each other out. Because the thing that I'm knowing is not just some dead thing, it is another being who can, by right, say, He is greater by knowing me, as I can say, I am greater by being the knower of He. And of course that becomes impossible. So both beings are equally great. Or, more critically, the concepts of greatness and higher and lowerness dissolve. The meeting is pure. It's the meeting of two friends, two equals. And it is the friendship that makes them one. But that friendship doesn't erase identity. The friendship is where they meet. That is the third thing. But that friendship does not mean the loss of identity, of either God's identity or the seeker's identity. That is the mystical understanding. That's so important. So, I know something completely, or as completely as I can. That other thing knows me as completely as it possibly can. And we remain as we are. There's no erasure. There's no violence done to the self. The knower, as knower, remains as he is. But he's changed in other ways. He's changed in the act of knowing. But he's changed in ways that can never be committed to Scripture or communicated or shared by anyone else. Each person must come to this satori on their own. this is not the kind of transformation that the sorcerer cares about. He's obsessed with superiority. He's obsessed with higher and lower, and greater and lesser, don't we know? Now, the unification of forces, right? The unification of these two forces is known in the mystical tradition as Dasein. Very important word, Dasein. And we're using it here slightly in its mystical connotation as opposed to its philosophical application, okay? And Dasein in this mystical sense is opposed to Sosein. Sosein refers to a world created by God. God is the author. He created something out of nothing, had a beginning, and it's going to have an end, and it's given unto us. We're His creations, and we're way down there as submissive beings. Dasein refers to the mystical magnum opus, something very profound, with man and God working together to create order, logos. They're an active lemniscate that you saw above the head of the magician. Active, but flowing in and out of each other, working together, overcoming the forces of disorder and ignorance. Man is godly because he shares God's antipathy to disorder and chaos. Leonardo is Vitruvian man, a man in order, a man who embodies the geometry and perfection of the universe. And such a mystic stands opposed utterly to the churches, which cast their shadow over man's soul, speak of man as a sinner, inhabiting a fallen creation, and speaking only of Jesus as the one perfect man. And everybody else is lower and sinful. But no, we got Jesus. He is the only perfect man, that we need to be worried about and venerating.
Not ready, you're going to stay pretending that you're just poor little me. And since you're all here and engaged in this sort of inquiry and listening to this sort of lecture, I assume that you're all on the process of waking up. Or else you're teasing yourselves with some kind of flirtation with waking up, which you're not serious about. But I assume maybe you are, not serious but sincere, that you are ready to wake up. So then, when you're in the way of waking up and finding out who you really are, what you do is what the whole universe is doing at the place you call here and now. You are something the whole universe is doing in the same way that a wave is something that the whole ocean is doing. The real you is not a puppet which life pushes around. The real deep down you is the whole universe. So then, when you die, you're not going to have to put up with everlasting non-existence, because that's not an experience. A lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. And sort of undergo that. But one of the most interesting things in the world, this is a yoga, this is a way of realization. Try and imagine what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Think about that. Children think about it. It's one of the great wonders of life. What will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And if you think long enough about that, something will happen to you. You will find out, among other things, that it'll pose the next question to you. What was it like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? That was when you were born. You see, you can't have an experience of nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. So after you're dead, the only thing that can happen is the same experience, or the same sort of experience as when you were born. In other words, we all know very well that after people die, other people are born. And they're all you. Only you can only experience it one at a time. Everybody is I. You all know you are you. And wheresoever beings exist throughout all galaxies, it doesn't make any difference. You are all of them. And when they come into being, that's you coming into being. You know that very well. Only you don't have to remember the past. In the same way, you don't have to think about how you work your thyroid gland or whatever else it is in your organism. You don't have to know how to shine the sun. You just do it. Like you breathe. Doesn't it really astonish you that you are this fantastically complex thing? And that you're doing all of this and you never had any education in how to do it?
Is simple to understand. It's the process of self-investigation, which is continual and ever expanding. You need to know that. It doesn't work unless you're aware of this. It doesn't have an end. We've been indoctrinated into thinking we can't think about that at all. We're always thinking about ends and fixed termination points. So the mystic has worked with that. He gets into the vibe of understanding what this ever expanding gnosis is all about. He also realizes that through this process of self-examination, all things are learned. Man is the kaleidoscope that reflects and mirrors everything. He's the ocean in the drop, not the drop in the ocean. Those who see that you're just a drop in the ocean and who tell you that, we know who they are. They're the sorcerers. The person who tells you, you're the ocean in the drop, they're the mystics. Now the primary tense, back to the concept of time here, the primary tense for a mystic is the past. Because he realizes that he doesn't stand alone. He is the outcome of a long line of mystics and sages who have been fighting evil, bringing order, creating that platform. He's the outcome of them all. It's been a process. It's a fight between good and evil. This is where Hegel, you see, comes in again. He talked about this unfolding of history and a certain important unfolding of the absolute idea. He wasn't just talking about erstwhile activity, just a hodgepodge of this and that kind of activity, but of a very important rational unfolding. He's talking about the logos again, culminating, and as that process continues, the inner house and the outer realm start becoming similar. They're reflections of one another. The external state and man's internal republic, you see, start to take on a rational aspect. And once we understand this mystical concept, we realize that it doesn't just deal with people who are religious. But when we're talking about order and disorder, we're talking about anyone. This is now affecting the lives of anyone. You don't have to be religious. Are you living in order or are you living in disorder? Both physical and mental. In fact, if you're living in disorder, then even when you become religious, this is sort of implied in what we've been saying, but if you're a person who's in disorder and then you seek out a religious doctrine, or you become religious, isn't it to be expected that those beliefs that you now have are the result of that very disorder that we're talking about? And that's why the mystic is asking you to become psychological. He's demanding it. He's saying you have to become a psychological being who's doing internal work in order to get out of that problem. Because, you'll be attracted towards something that is aberrant unless you have this order within. The mystic is also saying something deep. He's saying that, look, if the job of the mystic, motivated by this godly spark, is to bring order to disorder surely he must know the nature of disorder. If he's trying to bring good to evil, he must intimately know what evil is. So now he's a Dionysian as well as an Apollonian character. He must walk very close to what evil is. And he must lament. He must be a lamenter. He must cry. He must weep for the death of the good. Those who came before him, you see. Those who have fallen fighting evil before his time. He's very conscious of that. And he also must realize that he is not in a position to forgive a single instance of evil. Nobody has given him that right. And he also realizes that nothing exalts evil more than forgiveness. Yeah. Always, evil's enemies bring about evil's deliverance. He works that out. He understands how that's done. The mystic is one who lights candles and gathers a few laurel leaves for those previous sages, those great warriors against evil. Their past triumphs have brought him into being. They result in his destiny and his power and his intention. Now the enemies of the mystics want to erase the past. That's why the past is important to mystics, because the enemies of the mystics, they're not so interested in the past, at least in a healthy way. They're obsessed with the future, with progress, so-called. But these types, strangely, for all their interest in the future, progress, it's chaos that follows in their wake. And they're desperate to get man disassociated from his racial and his cultural roots. They're always denigrating the works of anyone great. Yet they're the ones always sprouting and spouting the words, talismanic words of individualism, freedom, progress. No one cries these terms more loudly than these sorcerers.
Just do everything I tell you to do. Jesus Christ, why don't you come save my life now? Open my eyes, blind me with your light now. Jesus Christ, why don't you come save my life now? Open my eyes, blind me with your light now. Becomes me when he speaks through me. He has needs like I do. We both want.
So now we have a grasp of what true mysticism entails, not the corrupted kind. And we see how heretical on one level these ideas are. We also have a grasp on how the dogmatic Judeo-Christian traditions are sort of manufactured, that religious doctrines can indeed be manufactured, made to order for public consumption, completely unpalatable to discerning minds. Remember that sword? The discerning mind sees through it. These mystics simply will not accept fixed, one-size-fits-all doctrines. In fact, the very word orthodox, if you look it up, means straight thinking, the straight way, rigid. Ignatius Loyola, the head of the Jesuits, actually said, I will believe that the white that I see is black, if the hierarchical church so defines it. Well, that's good to know. Is that what order is? That I'll believe whatever the hierarchical church tell me, even despite my own intellect? So we see now why our lover also is a being who stands at the junction of these two roads. These are the roads of order and disorder, internal work or external belief, So-Sein and Dasein. Earlier we said that the lover, when we talked about the Kabbalistic Ein and Ein Sof, we said that the lover is the repository of the creative light of the universe. Now we see that he can also be the source of that light. He's not just a simple emanation. When the spark is kindled and bright and strong, he now, walking in God's higher light, is also a source of that light to all intents and purposes. To realize this, to awaken that light, the mystic has to reject and disown ideas of higher and lower, as we saw. They're just not consistent with true mystical teachings. And those teachings have, as we also said, suffered contamination for generations at the hands of fools and sorcerers with toxic, anti-natural outlooks and beliefs. These are people who wish to humiliate the men of truth wherever they live and wherever they teach. And the return journey that we saw mentioned in the opening quote, it's not a regressive return. The mystic does not return to the Godhead in the infantile state in which he began at the outset. He returns as a whole or holistic being. He's kindled the light of God within himself, making himself eligible to know the true God. He also does not see God as a static being, as a static entity. He knows there can be no end either to his own being or to that of God's. Now, before his time, God may have walked with others down those roads, bringing light and order to the world. He may have walked down those paths. But from now on, God and he, the mystic, will travel together endlessly down many new paths, stronger and wiser than ever.
Orion, be my stars tonight. Fields grow anew with the spring of life. In this sheath of truth will I wrap myself tight. The landscape, it goes for miles. The myths of old, they breathe in me life. Strength comes to those who test their mind. Purity is a blinding light so bright, guiding us to the highest of heights. Running with the wolves and chasing the sun. Sometimes the moments can catch you undone. I see the great spirit in the birds that fly, in the whistle, the call and the cry. In the whistle, the call and the cry. with me on your wings, fully satisfied in what our mother brings. My thirst is quenched by all the songs you sing, heaping tables fit for kings. Running with the wolves and chasing the sun. Sometimes the moments can catch you undone. I see the great spirit in the birds that fly, in the whistle, the call, and the cry. Tales of old, they guide me to the right. Life be my quest, the noblest of plights. My soul cries aloud all our pain and strife. Wide is the still magnetic light. Running with the wolves and chasing the sun. Sometimes the moments can catch you undone. I see the great spirit in the birds that fly, in the whistle, the call, and the cry. In the whistle, the call, and the cry. In the whistle, the call, and the cry.